All right, everyone. Today, this is going to be a solo episode because Rui is traveling to New York. He's visiting some of his clients there. So it's just going to be me talking, and I'll talk about a framework from international relations that can also be applied to startups. I'm going to talk about imperial overstretch or imperial overreach. And I think as a framework, it can help you explain why some US startups fail in emerging markets. And I think it has a lot of implications for VCs and also for founders in how they should potentially think about competition in emerging markets. So hope you'll enjoy the show.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
All right. So first, I want to give some context of why I'm talking about a framework or a theory from international relations and why I want to apply this to startups. One of the goals that I have with this podcast is to try to create original content and also introduce some original thought and trying to provide you with some insights or some ideas that you haven't heard anywhere else. So I'm not sure how well developed this idea is, but I hope that you'll still enjoy it. And in case you disagree, feel free to comment below in the YouTube comments and tell me what you think about the argument that I'm making here. So the first thing that I want to talk about here is the idea of imperial overstretch and kind of explain what this idea really means. So this idea of imperial overreach was first coined by a historian from Yale University called Paul Kennedy. He wrote this book called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, and he wrote this book in like the 1980s. And it's basically a history book, but the idea of imperial overreach has been adopted by international relations theory to sort of like talk about balance of power between countries, etc. And the idea of imperial overreach is pretty simple and pretty intuitive. So the idea is that as empires become very, very big and very, very large, they start to extend their borders to a point that overextends or goes beyond their military capabilities, goes beyond their military and economic capabilities in order to defend these borders adequately. So ultimately, it's a theory about resource allocation to some extent. And that obviously also has a lot of implications in business, right? So a lot of business is about resource allocation. So I think that this idea of imperial overreach makes a lot of sense, because if great powers fail or great empires fail and crumble because they overextend and then struggle with resource allocation, they fail. And the same thing can happen to businesses, specifically to startups that are still often in a sort of fragile state. And the idea of imperial overreach is pretty simple and pretty intuitive. So the idea is that you, as an empire, you become too large, you extend your borders too much, you start having too many military conflicts on too many fronts, and you suffer from insufficient resource allocation. And you start losing the majority of your battles, and ultimately you crumble. So the first example that Paul Kennedy, the author of this book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, provides is the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire obviously was a huge empire. Basically, it conquered the known world. Like all of the Mediterranean was basically under the power or under control of the Romans at its peak, right? So the Romans obviously had all of Italy, parts of North Africa, the Iberia Peninsula. The Roman Empire extended more or less halfway through modern-day Germany, all of France, and all the way up to modern-day northern England. So this was a very, very extensive empire, but ultimately it started crumbling. And the idea here is that the Roman legions became too thinly spread out to properly defend the empire and started losing essential battles, primarily because they were not able to sustain number advantages in these different battles and on these different military fronts. And really this started to show with the lost battle of the Teutoburger Forest against Germanic tribes. So this was a huge battle where Rome as an empire lost about 30 or 40% of its entire military force. They lost like 3 or 4 legions in that single battle. And at the time, because it was technically already at peace. So they only had 12 legions or something like that. So the Roman Empire lost an immense amount of its military capability in that particular conflict, and or in that particular military encounter with Germanic tribes. And the Germanic tribes did actually manage to field very, very large numbers in that battle, because they managed to form an alliance between the different Germanic tribes. And this battle of the Teutoburger Forest basically started to some extent mark the crumbling of the Roman Empire. So one important point here is that this was actually not like a battle that was head on. So the Germanic tribes basically practiced guerrilla warfare for 3 or 4 days. So this battle lasted 3 or 4 days, and basically the Germanic tribes engaged in hit and run tactics and sort of slowly but surely wore down the Roman army and ultimately defeated them in that particular battle. As a quick side note that I think is important to particularly understand the fall of the Roman Empire here, is that it's kind of important to understand why Rome actually managed to conquer the known world. And there's a lot of historians that I'd say fetishize Roman military strategy to an extent that it's not historically correct anymore. So a lot of historians say that that Romans were these extremely talented and gifted military tacticians and strategists. And that there's some truth to this. So Romans did engage in some innovation in terms of how their units would form certain formations, which would give them some tactical advantages on the battlefield, etc. However, the main advantage that Rome had and the Roman military and the Roman army had throughout its history was a number advantage. And Romans were able to simply field larger armies than their opponents. So if you would have, I don't know, a Germanic tribe with 5,000 people, all of the tribe would go to war. The Romans would simply have 1 or 2 legions of 15 to 20,000 soldiers and would simply crush the tribe because of a number advantage. So the Romans were actually able to do this, were able to conquer the known world, not because of their military strategic talent, but because of taxes. They were simply able to field a larger army because they were the first ones to implement a very, very sophisticated tax system, which provided them with extreme economic power and enabled them to field a large professional army, sometimes of Roman citizens, but also mercenaries from other tribes, etc., and basically pay their soldiers. And because of that, they managed to generate a number advantage on the battlefield. And that context is a little bit important here, because if you think about it, this system worked really, really well. So Roman conquest and Roman dominance worked really well because they were able to create a number advantage in most military scenarios. But once the borders got so extensive and once they had so many military fronts, they were unable to scale their tax system and the economic system in order to continuously have a larger army in every military scenario. And that's why they started losing military engagements and ultimately crumbled. And, well, you then had the invasion of the Huns, you had the invasion of different Goth tribes, and ultimately Rome was sacked and the Roman Empire crumbled. So this is very, very interesting because there's a sort of a parallel here between how well does a startup scale and how well does an empire scale, right? A startup scales well to a certain extent, but once you start entering new markets or once you start having new military fronts, the system might not scale properly and you might not be able to replicate prior success. So I think that there's some interesting parallels between the Roman Empire and the Imperial Overreach and the problems that were caused for the Roman Empire and startups that grow too quickly and enter too many different markets too quick and then ultimately start losing in these different markets and sometimes have to retreat and only focus on their main market, their domestic market. So there are a few other examples in history of this idea of imperial overreach. So the first one that I mentioned was the Roman Empire, but you can make the same case for the Napoleonic Empire, which had rapid gains by conquest in the first decade of Napoleon's rule, and then ultimately overextended militarily when it attempted to conquer Russia in 1812. So same logic applies there. So again, like an overreach of its actual military capabilities, or basically scaling too fast and not being able to replicate prior military performance. And the same thing can be said for Nazi Germany, obviously, as well. When it started having a Western Front and an Eastern Front in Eastern Europe, ultimately that caused like an encirclement and ultimately Nazi defeat, right? So you could basically, the parallels here are very, very clear and very, very obvious. And you could say that the same thing is actually happening nowadays to the United States. There are some contemporary historians who say that exactly the same dynamic is happening for the US. So there's too many military conflicts. If we maybe take a time frame of like 50 years, you have the Vietnam War, which ended with a defeat in 1975, if I'm not mistaken. And then you can say that at least the other wars were not decisive victories, right? Afghanistan, I would say now was actually a defeat. Iraq, well, I don't want to get into the details here of whether these wars were won or lost, but you can certainly make a case that the American empire and American influence in the world is also slightly crumbling. And some historians make this argument that, the US has also suffered from a case of imperial overreach, engaging in too many military conflicts and not being able to win them decisively. And I think that is a fair point. Now, you can say the same thing, and I think it's a very interesting framework for also thinking about startups and how startups scale into other markets. And I think it definitely applies really, really well as an idea or as a framework for US startups and how they perform in emerging markets. So I think let's say, most prominent case here would be, or most obvious case would be Uber. So Uber, obviously an amazing company, managed to scale really, really quickly within the US, extend to different cities, had amazing performance in the US, and then also went global in a very, very aggressive way, but ultimately started getting outcompeted in a variety of different markets. And you could argue that was a problem of resource allocation, of, let's say, startup overreach or startup overstretch. So in China, Uber got beaten by Didi. In Southeast Asia, you had several very, very strong competitors emerge, such as Grab from, I believe they were originally from Singapore, but then started obtaining very, very large market share in other Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam, etc. Gojek was another ride-sharing company from Indonesia that obtained very, very large market share in Indonesia. You had Ola in India, which also basically competed with Uber and also beat Uber in India, and then actually extended into Australia and New Zealand. And then there were also a bunch of European competitors, such as Bolt, and then you also had Cabify from Spain that then also extended into Latin America and competed quite aggressively with Uber in Latin America. And then obviously Didi also extended into Latin America. So the point here is that Uber was this empire that started extending into all these different markets and ultimately started getting outperformed and losing market share quite aggressively towards some of these competitors. Another example, maybe on a smaller scale, would be Postmates, which entered into Mexico, never managed to get a foothold in Mexico, had to close its operations here, even though they were very, very successful in the US market, specifically in LA. They entered into Mexico City, never managed to get any market share, any significant market share in Mexico City. And that was sort of the beginning of the end for Postmates. Obviously, Postmates also a great company. And just as a side note, I'm not criticizing the founders here. It's often expected, right, in venture capital to try to become a global company, to try to compete in all these different markets. But it does have strategic challenges and maybe even some strategic disadvantages to try to engage in all these different markets and have all these different battles and have all these different fronts. And it kind of begs the question of whether there's maybe a natural limit to how large a startup can become. And that it's not that easy to simply launch in a new market, because there are also sort of specific nuances in customer acquisition strategies, in pricing, in brand positioning, in value proposition, etc. And another example that I'm very sort of intimately familiar with is Lambda School, who's now known as BloomTech. So Lambda School, after I think about a year of operating in the US, started quickly expanding into Africa, Latin America, Europe. At one point, I know that they were also recruiting a head of India, so they were also planning to go into India. So as a startup, as a young startup, Lambda School was very thinly spread, and ultimately had to withdraw from all these markets because they did not perform. And the interesting thing is that now in all these different markets, you have founders that have created startups, successful startups replicating the Lambda School model. For everyone for anyone who doesn't know Lambda School is basically an online programming school that enables students to study via cohort-based courses and finance their studies via income share agreements. So this model was successfully replicated in a lot of different markets. I know of concrete examples in Singapore, in the Philippines. There are European competitors. There are LATAM competitors. I'm one of the Lambda School LATAM competitors. We are basically the leading online programming school in Mexico and Colombia, offering income share agreements. Then there are also competitors in Argentina, in Brazil, etc. So Lambda School tried to extend into all these markets and ultimately got beaten or outcompeted by all these different founders in emerging markets, successfully outcompeted. And again, I want to maybe now circle back for a moment to the example of the Roman Empire. So the reason, and circle back to Teutoburger Forest, Wald is the German word for forest. So the Germanic tribes managed to beat the Roman military in the Battle of the Teutoburger Forest, primarily because they had local knowledge of the forest. So they used the terrain, they used the forest as a strategic advantage in order to defeat the Romans in this guerrilla warfare. So there were some nuances to the terrain and to the strategic advantages or disadvantages, or tactical advantages and disadvantages that you could extract from the terrain. And I think that there's a parallel here between US startups entering emerging markets and competing there with other local startups, right? Because you could say that all these different startups in emerging markets, also led by local founders, also have this intimate knowledge of the local terrain, and that there's specific knowledge of all these different elements that are very, very important in order to win a market, right? There are nuances in customer acquisition strategies. There are nuances in pricing, in brand positioning, even in the specific value proposition. So all these, let's say, copycats in emerging markets manage to outcompete their US competitors in these local markets, simply because they have this intimate local knowledge of how the acquisition engine should work, how the go-to-market strategy should work. And it basically means that these local entrepreneurs and local startups really have this local knowledge that can beat global players. And at the same time, like, these local markets are still large enough and relevant enough to be venture-backed opportunities, right? They're still very, very large markets, right? There's 350, the population in Latin America, for example, is 350 million, just as large as the US market. It really shows that local founders in emerging markets often have sort of quite significant advantages that are maybe not so tangible. So it's more like similar to the Romans and the Germanic tribes. Founders in emerging markets kind of know their own forest. That's how you can potentially think about it. And that's basically the idea that I wanted to present. And I think it has significant implications for founders in emerging markets, but also for VCs who are thinking about whether they should fund, let's say, copycats, even though I personally really dislike this term copycats, because I think that managing a startup has so many different nuances to it, and it's still so challenging. So it's kind of maybe not like the the right word is maybe just like local competitors. Let's call it local competitors. So like it really means that VCs that are considering this have to take this into account, right? Have to think about this idea of imperial overreach and whether local founders are able to potentially outcompete their US competitors because they have local knowledge which gives them a significant advantage. And that's all. That's the idea. I would love to hear what you think about it. If you think that this idea makes sense, if you think that it can explain some of the recent developments that we've seen in the competitive startup landscape. And also, in case you disagree, let me know why you disagree. If you're listening to this on the podcast, we also upload these to YouTube. So please go to the YouTube comments, find us, just Google and YouTube search, just look for The Momentum Project, subscribe to our channel, and I'll engage with you in the comments. So hope to see you there. Bye-bye.